quality risk items with those same stakeholders. And so everybody contributes their own piece to that list, and then it's a good idea at the end of the week, usually that's about how long it takes to interview the business and technical stakeholders. At the end of that week, you do a quick, say, 1 hour, maybe 2 hour review meeting with the stakeholders who participated to go through the final list and make sure that they're okay with it. So, you know, each stakeholder's total investment of time is maybe 4 hours, total across those two events, the interviews and the review meeting. So that is one way to do it. Now, another way to do it is the way that we did it here in the Pittsburgh in this particular launch, which is the big group brainstorming session. The big group brainstorming session, you get together all of the stakeholders in a room, and you go through that brainstorming process with them, and it takes all day. Now, obviously, this is a larger investment of time. It's easily twice as much, if not more, of the stakeholders who are participating in the risk analysis. Now, the benefit to them and to you and to everybody really is that the brainstorming approach, where everybody's together at once, does a much better job of better job of identifying risks and especially assessing the likelihood and impact associated with the risk and building a consensus about what the different likelihood and impact ratings mean. But I would say, you know, if you can't get people to commit to doing the big group brainstorming session, don't feel like, oh, you know, woe is us and we're not going to get the benefits out of this. You know, we have plenty of clients that use the one-on-one interview approach, and they're perfectly happy with it. In fact, most of the projects now at CA, when they do the pilots, they are going with the one-on-one interview approach. So we think that's very common for clients to do that. I don't think you're going to lose a whole lot. It's a little bit more work for you as the test person driving this process to try to build the consensus and to achieve agreement on some of the ratings and so forth. But it's still, you know, very practical approach, and it works just fine either way. Anyway, back to our case study. So we have the brainstorming that's going to go on all day, and so we broke that all-day session into two subsessions. So the first is an identification session, and what I did was I took the main quality risk categories out of that checklist and wrote them on whiteboards. We had 3 whiteboards in the meeting room, which is really nice. I'd recommend that if you're going to do this that way in that brainstorming session, try to use this approach. And you write the risk categories on these whiteboards and leave plenty of space, so that's why the 3 whiteboards is important. And then you give the participants in the risk analysis the sticky note pads and pens, and then say, look, write your risk items on the sticky notes, leaving a little bit of space at the bottom of them, and just go and stick them under the appropriate category. And, you know, people look at each other's risk items as they're going up and sticking them up there on the whiteboard, and they talk to each other and think about what the product does and so forth. And so that went on for about 3 hours before we finally just ran out of steam, and nobody had any new ideas for risk items. And we had 100 of them, which is fairly typical. 100 to 200 risk items is a fairly typical number to get. We also identified some byproducts during that risk analysis of 11 project risks and 3 other issues. Now, this will tend to happen, and don't worry about it if it does, but don't get hung up on these project risks. Remember, they're byproducts. You just want to identify them and move on. So at that point, it was noon, and we took a break for lunch. And I think the break for lunch is a good idea. If you're going to do these all-day brainstorming sessions, give people a chance to sort of walk away from it and go off and do something else with their brain for an hour. I would not try to do the catered lunch and then try to cram more brainstorming or risk assessment into the lunch hour. I think that's just too much. So we took an hour lunch break. People came back afterwards, and we went through each of the risk items and assessed them. And we rated the likelihood and impact for each risk item. So I would go through, read the risk item off on the sticky pad, and okay, what do we think the likelihood of this is? What do we think the impact is? Now, likelihood, let's be clear about what likelihood is. Likelihood is the likelihood that when you receive something to test, it will contain one or more bugs related to the risk item. So that's the likelihood rating for the risk item. The impact is, let's assume that the product did contain one or more bugs related to the risk item, and we didn't find it, and it went out to the customer. So now the customer is being faced with the typical kind of bug that we have and related to this risk item. How bad would that be from a business sense? Okay, so likelihood is a technical question, and the technical stakeholders obviously going to have more insight into this. Impact is a business question, and impact is more subjective. So what we typically find when we do these launches with clients is that the likelihood ratings are not too terribly hard to do, but impact, it takes a while for the team to get to consensus around what the different impact ratings are and what they mean. We rated likelihood and impact each on a 5-point scale, so very high, high, medium, low, and very low. So each of those we had a 5-point scale. And we did have defined criteria for what fit into each point on that scale. But still, you struggle with adjusting the criteria and internalizing the criteria too, especially with impact. Now, another thing that happens as you go through and do the assessment of the risk items is that you will identify duplicates. And then duplicates will happen, two people have the same idea. Now, in the big group brainstorming session, duplicates happen less. In the sequence of one-on-one interviews, though, I should mention this, that you will tend to get a fairly significant number of duplicates as you get to the end of the interviews. And that's actually a good thing, because that indicates that the people that you've talked to collectively have run out of ideas. And you want to, if you're doing the interview approach, you want to continue to do the interviews until you reach that point of convergence where you are getting a lot of duplicates from people that you talk to. But in the group brainstorming, if you identify a duplicate, you can just say, okay, well, this is a dupe of another one. Now, usually I want to capture that in my documentation, but I don't want to count it as a separate risk item. And if there are overlapping risk items, then you can reword them, since you have the stakeholders in the room, and reword them to be non-overlapping. So at the end of this overall session, we have 92 risk items that we have identified, and 40% of those have been rated. And we've come to sort of a meeting of the minds, as it were, across the stakeholders about how to rate these risk items, how to assign the likelihood and impact values. So after the session, the test manager went off the next day and spent some time working one-on-one with some of the other participants to finalize the ratings. And that can happen. That's not a big disaster. If you don't finish all of the ratings in the brainstorming session, at least you should have achieved a consensus about what the different ratings mean, and kind of struggle with that a little bit. So on this slide, you see an excerpt. It was basically what the documents look like, or document to look like, at the end of that day session. So I want to point out a few key things here. I'm going to leave aside this header at the top. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Now let me point out, here's the category. So the category of functionality here, and we have, as I said, about 20 or so other categories that are of interest. And every risk item has a risk ID number, which we can use for traceability in the test management system, whatever test management system we use. So 1.001 is Unix system services compatibility issues. Okay? And so that's a risk item. That's been assessed as a 4, which is low likelihood. We use a descending scale where the smaller numbers, 1, 2, were at the higher end of the scale, and the bigger numbers, 4 and 5, were at the lower end of the scale, with 3 in the middle. So we get, this is a very low, or excuse me, a low likelihood, and a 3 impact, so that's a medium impact.